Kia ora everyone, and welcome to this video where I will talk you through the critical text standard so that you've got an example. I'm going to be referring to the Handmaid's Tale as an example because lots of students at our school have read that or have studied this as their novel. So that's the novel that I'm just going to refer to. I'll talk a little bit more about what types of texts you might want to choose. So, first of all, a reminder, what is critical text? First of all, it's worth 4 credits. Essentially, you need to analyze one text, and so that's really important to remember. You're only looking at one primary text, so that can be a film, a novel, a poem, a short story. Though with poems and short stories, often we might recommend that you look at more than one. It depends a little bit on what the poem is, how long it is, or how long the short story is, those types of things. Sometimes it makes sense to look at collections of those, just so you've got a bit of evidence. You might also want to look at an episode of a television show or a children's story, whatever you like, really. Once you've read that or you've watched that, you will also need to read critical readings, and so that is part of the standard. There's 2 different versions of it, so you can either look at the text through a particular lens and therefore focus on particular elements of the text, or you can come up with your own hypothesis, which is essentially a statement that you believe is true as you set out at the beginning of your research, essentially, and then you are seeking to prove that you're right, and you might find that you are 100% right, or you might find that you change your mind in the process, both of which would be fine. The key bit to remember here for the standard is that you must have 2 critical texts. So they should be articles, and they should be articles by experts on the subject. So you can't just find a review on stuff. You want to sort of look at perhaps university scholars or people who've done quite a lot of research on a particular author or director. And so your teachers can help you with that. Okay, so let's have a look. If we looked at The Handmaid's Tale through a lens, there are a couple of options that we might be able to look through. So obviously gender criticism is one that stands out straight away because there's such a divide in the novel that falls along gender lines. So we could look at feminism. You could look at it through a post-colonial lens, and sort of look at the power structures that we find in Gilead and the process through which the state has arrived at its in its current organizational state, and what the different what the causes and the results were, but also like who remains in power and who's no longer in power, and how those different groups are viewed by others. You could look at it through a reader response theory, so looking at what's the reader experience like, what does the reader bring to the novel, what kind of knowledge do they bring, and to what extent does that also shape the novel. Please discuss with your teachers if you're unsure what lens you might want to use. There's lots and lots of different options. So we have had a Marxist analysis of SpongeBob last year, and we have had a Freudian analysis of Winnie the Pooh. So there's lots of things that you can do. There are also like lots of little bits that are actually fun to do. So don't limit yourself to thinking that you must have a particular kind of text. Like, do go to your teacher and have a conversation, and you might be able to find something that you're really interested in. It's worthwhile doing that for this particular standard. Okay, so if we look at our hypothesis, then essentially you want to consider or think about what some aspects of the novel are that are up for debate, and therefore you can take a stand on. So you might look at Offred as a character, how believable the regime is, or what perhaps Margaret Atwood's purpose was, and you could form a hypothesis based on that. You could look at some of the ideas and how those might be explored a bit further, so how regimes take their power or how language is used to manipulate people. So you could look at that, or you might want to look at how readers might react to the novel, what their position might be, or also, like, why is it considered to be part of a kind of canon? Like, why is it seen as a classic? why is it so widely read, or why has it had this some kind of revival recently. That would be an interesting one to look at. I'm just going to go over 2 student exemplars that we had in 2019. And so those examples gained E for critical text, and they also gained M or E in the final exam written about The Handmaid's Tale. And so one of the things to be really aware of is that when you do critical text on a particular text, you get a really thorough understanding of the text, and you can then use that kind of knowledge in your external as well. And so even from that point of view, it might be worthwhile. If you would like to write about The Handmaid's Tale in the external and you have already done critical text, you could also use it for connections, which I'll talk about in a separate video, so that's an option for you. Okay, so here's a hypothesis example. So this student came up with the hypothesis: Offred is not the hero and feminist the reader desired her to become. To support that hypothesis, the student found 2 pieces by university scholars about Offred, and so one about Offred and one about heroism in The Handmaid's Tale. So this is another thing to be aware of. Like, you don't have to find articles that are 100% already backing your hypothesis. You can find articles from scholars that cover elements of your topic, and you can then apply those to serve your argument. So don't worry if you don't quite find an article that says exactly what you're wanting to say, because it might be you who says this thing for the first time. Okay, just to make sure that you've got some backup. Okay, here is an example of their conclusion. Edward wanted to tell a dystopian story from a female's perspective, but what she did was tell a dystopian story from a passive female's perspective. Offred is not the hero and feminist the reader desired her to become. She is unlike the typical heroine, like Katniss Everdeen or Princess Leia. She isn't brave or a standout character, and her behaviour at times seems to undermine feminism rather than support it. Edward did not give us a likeable hero, but she did so on purpose. It is through Offred's lack of heroism and feminism that Edward challenges the reader to think about how we too perpetuate the system and regimes we live within. Offred's apathy is our own apathy. If Edward had created Offred to be a fighter who breaks the Gilead system, the reader would not be left with the frustration that Offred's actions, which is how the core message of the text is understood. So, as you can see in this conclusion, the writer or the student has confirmed their own hypothesis, but they've also further explained that this was exactly what Edward needed to do to leave the reader to an extent frustrated, and therefore have the biggest impact on the reader. And so they've done a really good job here, basically proving their hypothesis to be right, but also saying, well, this was actually a really clever way of doing it. So, you know, those types of conclusions, that type of thinking is what we would like to see when you're working on the critical text. Okay, second example, just a quick warning, there's a reference to sexual abuse in it. So we've got a hypothesis task again. The Handmaid's Tale portrays the negative effects of sexual abuse on survivors and how sexual abuse is enabled by bystanders. Again, the person has used 2 research papers, one on the effects of sexual abuse on survivors, so nothing to do with The Handmaid's Tale, and the other one was about the bystander effect and sexual abuse. So again, those 2 papers were not specifically on The Handmaid's Tale, rather they were research papers about the issue of sexual abuse and bystanders, and so because that's in their hypothesis, they can use research like that and then apply it to the text. That's perfectly fine. So it's a really good example how you can use multiple different sources to support the hypothesis that you are trying to make about a fictional text or about a text, and you can still use those sources even though they are not explicitly about your text. So critical text is all about applying the sources that you have to work for your argument. Okay, so here's the conclusion the student has written. The Handmaid's Tale shows how survivors of sexual abuse have negative psychological effects, and the way the regime condones sexual abuse through bystanders, literally the wives during the ceremony. Offred disconnects from her body and later considers suicide. Both show the psychological effects of the legalized sexual assault of women through the ceremony. The Society of Gilead condones sexual abuse and creates bystanders in the wives and aunts, for example, but also the foreign governments and tourists in Gilead who know what is going on and do nothing about it. Through the character of Offred, we see the consequences of not protecting those who suffer sexual abuse and are challenged to not be bystanders, rather. So, as you can see, this conclusion again is going quite broad. So, it's looking specifically at the sexual abuse that happens in the novel, but it's also looking at who are the bystanders, and it's looking really broadly here. So it's not just looking at the people who are actually part or witness the ceremony, but it's also looking at, okay, we've got foreign governments as well who know what is going on, and we've got tourists here as well who ignore that. So these are people or characters really on the periphery of those ceremonies and what's at the core of the regime in Gilead. But the student has done a really good job observing that everybody who knows something and does nothing is a bystander in that sense, and their two research papers have really helped them make that point very convincingly. Okay, so that should have given you a good idea of what critical text is about. So just summarizing this at the end here. For critical text, you need one primary text. That can be a film, a novel, could be poems, short stories, could be a documentary. We've also had a student write a critical text on an album, so that worked quite well. It works much better than just one song. You will need 2 critical readings written by experts. So this cannot just be a review written on stuff. It needs to be more sophisticated, somebody who's actually got a bit of credibility in the area that you're interested in. There's 2 versions of the standard, so you can write a hypothesis task, or you can use the lens task. And so have a chat to your teacher which one might be most useful for the topic in the text that you are interested in. And then the key bit at the end there is that you need to come to your own conclusions. So based on reading the text and reading the 2 critics' texts or their perspectives, you need to share your own reflections and the conclusions that you are coming to based on, your personal views as well as the perspectives of the critics. Alright guys, hopefully this has given you enough information on critical text. As per usual, please talk to your teachers if you've got any questions about this. They will be able to provide more guidance. Alright, take care and goodbye.